There was a time when Canadian kids left the house at 8 a.m. and didn't come home until dark. No cell phones, no GPS tracking, no parents checking on them every hour. They built explosives with chemistry sets, rode in cars without seatbelts, and bought cigarettes at age 12 for their parents. All of this was completely normal. Today, every single one of these activities would get parents arrested for child endangerment. If you tried raising kids today the way Canadian parents raised kids in the 1950s and 60s, Child Protective Services would remove your children within a week. Here are 15 things Canadian kids did every day that are now illegal, criminally negligent, or would get you reported to authorities immediately. 1. Riding in cars without seatbelts or car seats. Kids rode in cars lying down in the back window. They sat on parents' laps in the front seat. They stood up between the front seats while the car was moving. Station wagons had rear-facing seats where kids rode backwards watching traffic behind them. Nobody wore seatbelts because most cars didn't have them. Here's what the data shows. Canadian motor vehicle deaths for children under 15 were 12.4 per 100,000 in 1960. By 2020, that number dropped to 1.1 per 100,000. The difference is safety regulations that didn't exist in the 1960s. Cars were death traps, and parents put kids in them anyway because everyone did. But here's what would happen today. You put a child under 12 in a car without a proper car seat and booster seat. You're breaking the law in every Canadian province. The fines range from $200 to $1,000, depending on province. Police can pull you over specifically for child safety seat violations. What was normal parenting in 1960 is now a criminal offense. Parents in the 50s and 60s didn't know better. Today you can't claim ignorance. The law is explicit and enforced. 2. Leaving kids home alone for entire days. 8-year-olds were left home alone all day during summer vacation. Parents went to work, kids made their own breakfast, entertained themselves, and were expected to not burn the house down. 10-year-olds babysat 5-year-olds for hours without adult supervision. This was standard across Canada. Here's the legal reality today. Most Canadian provinces don't have specific laws stating minimum age for staying home alone, but child welfare agencies use 10 to 12 years as guidelines. Leaving an 8-year-old home alone all day would trigger Child Protective Services investigation immediately. Multiple complaints, and you're facing neglect charges. But here's what's changed beyond law. Social expectations. In the 1960s, neighbors saw kids home alone and thought nothing of it. Today, neighbors see kids home alone and call authorities. The behavior didn't become more dangerous. Society's tolerance for risk disappeared completely. A mother in Winnipeg in 2014 was charged with child abandonment for leaving her kids in a car for 5 minutes while running into a store. In 1965, kids were left home alone for 8 hours daily all summer. The legal and social standards have inverted completely. 3. Playing with mercury from broken thermometers. When thermometers broke, kids played with the mercury. They rolled it around in their hands. They broke it into smaller balls and watched them reform. Teachers let students pass mercury around classrooms as a science demonstration. Nobody wore gloves. Nobody worried about toxicity. Here's the health reality. Mercury is a neurotoxin. Elemental mercury exposure causes tremors, cognitive impairment, and kidney damage. The liquid mercury in old thermometers contained enough to cause serious health effects with repeated exposure. Kids were playing with poison and adults let them. A thermometer breaks in a Canadian school, and the building gets evacuated. Hazmat protocols activate. The area is sealed off. Professional cleanup is required. Parents are notified. If a teacher let kids play with mercury today, they'd be fired immediately and potentially face criminal negligence charges. The mercury itself hasn't changed. Our understanding of its danger changed. Kids in the 60s weren't tougher. They just didn't know they were poisoning themselves. 4. Buying cigarettes for parents at age 10. Kids walked to corner stores with notes from parents asking for cigarettes. Store owners sold cigarettes to children as young as 8 or 10 without question as long as they had a note. Kids also bought cigarettes for themselves, starting around age 12. Nobody checked ID because there were no age restrictions. Canada didn't establish federal minimum age for tobacco purchase until 1908, and it was only enforced in some provinces. By the 1960s, most provinces had age restrictions around 16, but enforcement was essentially non-existent. Kids bought cigarettes freely, but here's today's reality. Selling tobacco to anyone under 18 is illegal across Canada. Fines for retailers range from $500 to $5,000. Parents sending kids to buy cigarettes would be charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The kid buying cigarettes would trigger mandatory reporting to child welfare services. Corner stores in the 60s had cigarette vending machines accessible to anyone. Kids bought packs of Players or Export A on their way to school. Try that today and everyone involved faces criminal charges. Drinking from garden hoses and street puddles. Kids drank from garden hoses all summer. They drank from outdoor water fountains that birds bathed in. They drank from streams and creeks while playing outside. Some kids admitted drinking from puddles when nothing else was available. Parents knew and didn't care. Here's what we know now. Garden hoses contain lead and phthalates that leach into water. Stagnant water in hoses grows bacteria including Legionella. Stream water contains parasites like Giardia that cause severe illness. Puddles are contaminated with whatever was on the ground. Kids were drinking water that would fail every safety test. But here's the modern standard. Public health agencies specifically warn against drinking from garden hoses, especially water that's been sitting in the hose. Parents who knowingly let kids drink contaminated water could face neglect charges if the kids get sick. Kids in the 60s had iron stomachs not because they were tougher, but because they survived exposure to pathogens that would hospitalize modern children who haven't built up the same resistance. 6. Building dangerous things with unrestricted chemistry. Chemistry sets in the 1950s and 60s contained real chemicals: sulfur, potassium nitrate, magnesium ribbon, copper sulfate, and other compounds that could create actual chemical reactions. Kids built rockets, made explosives, created smoke bombs, and conducted experiments that produced toxic fumes, all in their basements without supervision. Here's what these sets contained. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, sold in the 1950s, contained actual uranium ore samples. Kids could measure radioactivity with an included Geiger counter. The set was marketed to children and sold in toy stores. This was considered educational, not dangerous. But here's modern reality. Today's chemistry sets are neutered completely. They contain safe substances that barely react with each other. Any compound that could cause injury, explosion, or toxic exposure is banned. Riding bikes with no helmets into traffic. Kids rode bikes everywhere without helmets. They rode on highways. They rode through busy city streets. They did tricks, jumps, and stunts without protective gear. Kids just got back on the bike afterward. Bicycle-related head injuries decreased 85% after helmet laws were implemented across Canadian provinces in the 1990s and 2000s. Studies show helmets reduce head injury risk by 60 to 88%. Kids in the 60s were suffering preventable brain damage at rates that would be considered an epidemic today. But here's the legal reality now. Every Canadian province, except Alberta, has mandatory helmet laws for minors. Fines range from $25 to $100, but the real consequence is social. Let your kid ride without a helmet, and neighbors will confront you. Multiple complaints to police, and you're dealing with Child Protective Services. Kids in the 60s rode bikes as transportation and recreation with zero protective gear. Today, kids need helmets even for riding in empty parks. The activity is identical. The legal and social requirements changed completely. 8. Playing outside, unsupervised until streetlights came on. Kids left home after breakfast and weren't expected back until dinner or dark. Parents didn't know where they were. No check-ins, no cell phones. Kids ranged miles from home, played in construction sites, explored abandoned buildings, and swam in unsupervised areas. Parents considered this normal childhood. Here's what could happen in the 60s. Kids got hurt regularly. Broken bones, cuts requiring stitches, near drownings. But unless the injury required a hospital, parents just patched kids up and sent them back out. The freedom came with accepted risk that modern parents would consider negligence. But here's today's standard. Free-range parenting is now controversial and legally risky. A mother in Ontario had Children's Aid called on her for letting her kids play in their own backyard unsupervised. Kids walking to parks alone trigger concerned citizen calls to police. What was normal independence in 1965 is now seen as parental neglect. The Peel Regional Police in Ontario launched a campaign specifically about not leaving children unsupervised in public places. Behavior that defined childhood in the 60s is now police enforcement priority. 9. Working dangerous farm jobs at age 10. Kids worked on farms operating heavy machinery. 10-year-olds drove tractors. 12-year-olds worked in grain silos. Teenagers operated combines and balers. Farm kids worked 10-hour days during harvest season while school was in session. This was family obligation, not child labor. Here's the safety data. Agriculture had the highest child fatality rate of any industry in the 1960s. Kids died in tractor rollovers, grain silo suffocations, and machinery entanglements regularly. These weren't freak accidents. They were predictable results of children operating dangerous equipment without safety training. But here's modern law. Canadian provinces have minimum age requirements for operating farm equipment. Ontario's Farming and Food Production Protection Act sets 16 as minimum age for operating tractors on public roads. Saskatchewan requires safety training certification for young farm workers. Putting a 10-year-old on a tractor today would be criminal child endangerment. Farm families in the 60s needed child labor to survive economically. Modern agriculture has safety regulations that prioritize child welfare over productivity. The economic model changed because society decided child safety mattered more than farm efficiency. 10. Swimming in unsupervised lakes and quarries. Kids swam in lakes, rivers, and abandoned quarries with no lifeguards, no supervision, and no safety equipment. They dove off cliffs into water of unknown depth. They swam in areas with strong currents. Drownings happened, but kids kept swimming in the same spots. Here's the mortality data. Drowning was the second leading cause of accidental death for Canadian children in the 1960s. Most drownings occurred in unsupervised natural water bodies. Kids drowned and other kids kept using the same swimming holes because that's where you swam. But here's today's liability reality. Public beaches require lifeguards and safety equipment by law. Parents taking kids to unsupervised water could face negligence charges if something happens. Property owners who allow kids to swim in their ponds or quarries face massive liability. Swimming unsupervised is legally risky for everyone involved. Kids in the 60s learned to swim by being thrown in water and figuring it out. Modern kids take swimming lessons in controlled environments with certified instructors. One approach caused preventable deaths. The other is overprotective by 1960s standards, but legal by today's. 11. Hitchhiking as normal transportation for teenagers. Teenagers hitchhiked routinely. They stood on highways with thumbs out waiting for rides from strangers. Parents knew their kids hitchhiked and considered it normal transportation. Kids hitchhiked to school, to jobs, and across provinces during summer vacation. Here's what the risk actually was. Statistics Canada data shows hitchhiking-related crimes were significantly higher in the 1960s and 70s than today. Assaults, abductions, and murders of hitchhikers occurred regularly enough that some highways became known for disappearances. Parents still let kids hitchhike. But here's today's standard. Telling your teenage daughter to hitchhike to school would result in immediate Child Protective Services investigation. Picking up teenage hitchhikers as an adult puts you at legal risk, even if you're trying to help. The practice that was normal transportation is now considered reckless endangerment. The Highway of Tears in British Columbia became infamous for hitchhiker disappearances. Yet in the 60s, hitchhiking was so normalized that parents didn't see it as dangerous despite evidence. 12. Buying fireworks and using them without supervision. Kids bought fireworks directly from stores without age restrictions. They set them off in backyards, streets, and fields without adult supervision. Firecrackers, bottle rockets, and cherry bombs were widely available. Kids lost fingers and suffered burns regularly. This was accepted as part of playing with fireworks. Here's the injury statistics. Emergency rooms treated thousands of pediatric fireworks injuries annually in the 1960s. Burns, finger amputations, and eye injuries were common. The injuries were predictable and preventable. Nobody prevented them. But here's modern law. Every Canadian province restricts fireworks sales and use. Many types available in the 60s are now illegal entirely. Age restrictions prohibit sales to minors. Using fireworks without permits can result in fines of $500 to $5,000. Parents letting kids set off fireworks unsupervised would face charges if injuries occurred. Victoria Day and Canada Day were occasions when kids blew things up with minimal supervision. Modern regulations turned fireworks from children's entertainment into adult supervised activities with legal consequences for violation. 13. Drinking unpasteurized milk straight from farms. Families bought milk directly from farms. The milk wasn't pasteurized. Kids drank it immediately without any processing. Raw milk was considered healthier and tastier than store-bought pasteurized milk. Nobody worried about contamination. Here's the health risk. Unpasteurized milk contains bacteria, including Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria. These cause serious illness, especially in children. Kids drinking raw milk in the 60s were repeatedly exposed to pathogens. But here's today's law. Selling unpasteurized milk for human consumption is illegal across Canada under federal law. Fines reach up to $250,000. Parents giving kids raw milk would face child endangerment charges if the children became sick. Kids in the 60s drank milk that would fail every safety inspection today. 14. Playing in active construction sites. Construction sites were playgrounds. Kids climbed equipment, explored partially built structures, and played in excavations. Sites had minimal fencing. Nobody chased kids away. Injuries happened when kids fell from heights or got hurt by equipment. Parents considered it the kids' fault for being careless. Here's the injury reality. Construction sites caused hundreds of pediatric injuries annually in Canadian cities during the 60s. Falls, crush injuries, and equipment-related trauma sent kids to hospitals regularly. The sites weren't designed for children, yet children played there constantly. But here's modern liability. Construction sites must be fenced and secured when not in operation. Signs warn against trespassing. Companies face enormous liability if children are injured on their sites, even outside work hours. Parents whose kids play in construction sites could face neglect charges. Kids in the 60s used construction equipment as jungle gyms. Modern construction sites are locked down specifically to prevent child access. The materials and hazards haven't changed. The legal liability changed everything. 15. Bringing pocket knives to school. Boys carried pocket knives to school routinely. They used them to sharpen pencils, cut string, and play games like mumble-te-peg where you throw knives at the ground. Teachers knew students had knives. Nobody considered this dangerous. It was a tool, not a weapon. Here's the cultural context. Canadian boys were given their first pocket knife around age 8 as a rite of passage. Learning to use a knife responsibly was considered part of growing up. Schools didn't ban knives because knives were normal tools that children were expected to know how to use. But here's today's zero-tolerance reality. Bringing any knife to school results in immediate suspension or expulsion. Police are called. The student may face criminal weapons charges. Parents face questions about why their child had access to weapons. What was a normal tool in 1965 is a serious criminal offense in 2025. The knives haven't changed. Society's perception of children with knives changed completely. A pocket knife that was a boy's prized possession in the 60s would get that boy arrested today. Here's the pattern across all 15 examples. Things that were normal in the 1950s and 60s are now illegal because we learned they were killing and injuring children at preventable rates. Cars without seatbelts killed kids. Mercury poisoned kids. Cigarettes addicted kids. Unsupervised activities led to drownings and injuries. We have data now that we didn't have then, but here's the other pattern. Some changes aren't about safety data. They're about liability, litigation, and social expectations shifting toward zero-risk tolerance. Kids today are statistically safer than kids in the 60s by every metric. They're also more restricted, more supervised, and have less independence than any generation in Canadian history. Canadian kids in the 50s and 60s had freedom that would get modern parents arrested. They also died and were injured at rates that would be considered unacceptable today. The trade-off between freedom and safety has shifted completely in 60 years. The activities weren't illegal then, because society accepted risks that we now consider unacceptable. Whether kids today are overprotected or kids then were neglected depends on whether you value independence or safety more. What's not debatable is that doing any of these 15 things today would have legal consequences that simply didn't exist in the 1960s.